Hello, I'm Dr. Torna Pitman from Gender Equality, a Tasmanian statewide family violence service. Welcome to video 6 of the Coercive Control series. Today is the video on the effects of coercive control. The effects of coercive control can be cognitive, emotional, physical, as well as the increase in material disadvantage and a reduction in life chances. So the effects of coercive control are formidable and wide and deep, and they're different for each person depending on the style of coercive control that they experienced. Next week, I explain the stages of coercive control, which are intertwined with the effects. In fact, every video is intertwined and interrelates. So stay tuned, because coming up is the information on the effects of coercive control. So the effects of coercive control is today's topic. I'm going to be taking you through this PowerPoint, and this is where we're at in the series. So we're on Thursday, July 2020, July 30th, the effects of coercive control. We've been through the introduction, the dynamics, and the tactics and the styles. Today's the effects. Next Thursday is the stages. The Thursday after is the children. And the Thursday after that is the post-separation consequences and challenges, which are extensive. And then lastly, the transformation, healing and reconfiguring of life that's possible within a context of coercive control. But today, we're looking at the effects. It's really important to remember that coercive control is a patterned misuse and abuse of power in an intimate relationship. The attitudinal style of the coercive controller will bring about a particular pattern of boundaries and rights violations, the type of which will depend upon the style of the coercive controller. There may still be good times or fun times or better times, but even so, underneath it all, the web of dynamics will still be detectable. So today the outline is, first of all, a brief revisiting of previous episodes, looking at the historical approaches to studying the effects of coercive control, the web of responses to the web of dynamics, the overall effects of coercive control and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and finally, a summary. So let's revisit some previous episodes. Last week, we talked about the different styles of coercive control. Now, the different styles are really critical to have some understanding of. Sorry about that. First of all, the water torturer is the style of coercive controller who really knows how to use conversation against you and to keep you really in a very oppressed and disempowered situation, because they can always turn everything back towards you in a really skillful, relentless, low-level, emotionally abusive manner. It generally doesn't include physical violence, but it may do, and it certainly may do around separation. The drill sergeant, the terrorist, and Rambo, those three styles of coercive control are much more likely to include physical violence. The drill sergeant is incredibly controlling in every area of the relationship. The water torturer will have their areas of the relationship that they want to control, but the drill sergeant will control everything. The terrorist will also control everything in your life, as well as being incredibly frightening and threatening and using threats of other people hurting you if he doesn't himself. Rambo is the type of coercive controller who tends to be coercive or intimidating to everyone. So he stands out. He's often in court, and he doesn't like authority. He will also white knight you, so that when you have just come out of a relationship that wasn't good for you, you are very vulnerable to a Rambo type who is initially a white knight and very gallant, and then eventually it emerges that he is overall an intimidator. Demand man will want to have all his demands met, and this is where it's more likely that you can see this in other genders, that this idea of always having their demands met in order for the household to run anywhere near smoothly. And when they're all met and everything is done in their way, the household can actually operate in some equilibrium, but only because it's all revolving around demand person. Now, Mr. Right, or any gender, is always right. They have a really skillful way of beating you in any argument, to the point where that's their style. Every argument is theirs to win and be right, and that's their approach to the whole relationship. They will be right about everything within the relationship, and you are at risk of your own idiocy when you are up against someone like Mr. or Mrs. Right. The player is someone who will play you off with other people. You're often in between the player and his or her ex-partner, and a bit of a pawn, so that you're being battered around by that dynamic. Or if it's not that dynamic, it's just bringing in other people to the relationship, because the player generally feels that they're very, very sexually alluring and they need to have a lot of sex, and they will create all kinds of ways of justifying to you that that it's their right and that you're just a little bit oversensitive to these things. The victim and Mr. Sensitive and the water torturer are often mixed up together. They often work together. You can find a coercive controller who has very strong tendencies to the water torturer, low-level, relentless emotional abuse. Mr. Sensitive, who likes to talk a lot of psychobabble and jargon and act new age, but is actually prone to analysing you and generally pushing away all your needs and all your very normal requirements for a healthy, equal kind of relationship. Mr. Sensitive plays the sensitive card all the time, and that can be very hard for other people to detect, because they can come across very well. And so too can the victim, but the victim is always hard done by, and if you challenge them or counter them, then you are also doing wrong by them and being abusive to them like everybody else. So every one of these styles has a way of controlling, and quite often you'll find that a coercive controller could be a mixture of all of them, and they may just be very similar to one kind of style. Now, the mentally ill and addictive abuser, that can be a part of any one of the styles, and it's usually used to hang over your head that, you know, if you trigger me because my mental illness or my addiction, then that's your fault and you'll be responsible for the consequences. So they hold it over your head, and sometimes they claim to be mentally ill when they're actually not. And so to get your head around all those coercive styles really does put you on a different level of how you see family violence, how you understand coercive control, what kind of a relationship and what kind of a person is going to be interested in equality with you. So now I'm just going to change this slide. Now here we have the colonizing attitudes that I just want to go over with you. There's a sign in the Cootamundra Domestic Training Home for Aboriginal Girls that was in Australia, New South Wales. And it said, act white, think white, and be white. So the young Aboriginal girls who were taken from their families against their will and at their expense were supposed to look at that sign every day and remember to act white, think white, and be white. Now that is an example of colonizing attitudes. You should be like me. That country should be like our country. So we will colonize them and take them over and turn them around to how we want them to be, because we think that's better for them. You couldn't get anything more along the lines of a superior, entitled, and adversarial attitude if you tried. And those attitudes are part of coercive control, and they bleed through the entire relationship. And colonizing attitudes give rise to colonizing behaviors, and they're all the behaviors that I've already gone over with you before, and I'll go over with you again. Conversational control, intermittent niceties, retaliation, lack of empathy, keeping you on a continuum of fear, obligation, guilt, or shame. And those are the colonizing type behaviors, and they turn up in every part of the relationship. Colonizing attitudes and behaviors end up in every part of your relationship with the coercive controller. And if you're being colonized, such as these young Aboriginal children, it affects every part of their life. There is no way that they can be rescued from that. That kind of sign, act white, think white, and be white, is colonizing. So in each part of the relationship, those colonizing attitudes are going to result in you being silenced, isolated, exploited, subjugated, alienated, or threatened to some degree. Now, it'll be different for each person who experiences coercive control. And again, it depends upon the style of the coercive controller and which areas of the relationship they were most invested in to keep you under the thumb. For example, a drill sergeant is very invested in keeping you under the thumb in every area of this relationship. A water torturer may not be so worried about who you go and see, what you go and do, and it may not be particularly interested in sex at all. So there's all different styles. So colonizing works as an analogy to help us understand the depth and breadth of coercive control, because using a colonizing analogy avoids fragmenting people's experiences into discrete forms of abuse, such as economic, social, emotional, sexual. Whereas that's useful, the discrete forms of abuse, it's really just the areas where the colonizing attitudes play out in the relationship. So colonizing attitudes play out in the sexual area of the relationship and become sexual abuse. So using a colonizing analogy helps to link the forms of abuse together, because in the olden days, when they were first researching family violence, they got very stuck into dividing it into separate forms of abuse, which is really useful. But scaffolding upon that is how we link all those forms of abuse together, and that's the core of attitudes and the types of behaviours that result in those forms of abuse. A colonizing analogy also illustrates the total immersion as well as the entrapment of victims in coercive control. It doesn't come and go. It's not like you can be colonized one day and not the next. If you're colonized, those young Aboriginal children, they were colonized 24/7. It's not like there were periods where they weren't. It's in the air. It's in the style of how you're related to. A colonizing analogy also works because it avoids a reliance on dates, incidents, and episodes or events to prove it, but a course of conduct and a pattern of relating that refuses full citizenship and equality. And lastly, a colonizing analogy works because it also explains why post-separation women, with children in particular, have to extricate themselves from colonial rule, control, exploitation, and neglect in order to achieve independence and restore their lives. So let's have a look at conversational control again. This is quite critical to the whole thing. It's core to colonizing and it's core to coercive control. And it works like this. Conversational control, if I was the coercive controller, this is what I would be saying. I will dominate the structure of the conversation and I use passive or active tactics to get you to cater or submit to me. I will control if, when, how, on what topic, and for how long we will have a conversation. This means I control the foundations and the building of the relationship, and you will try to resist me, but you will have to know what you are doing and be prepared to be criticized and very disapproved of in the process by me. Now, verbal abuse. Sometimes my conversational tactics include passive or aggressive language that is loud or quiet, and the words put you down. I will affect your self-esteem when I insult you, criticize you, humiliate you, or when I tune you out. When I subject you to double standards and double binds, it is often verbally abusive and always emotionally abusive. Emotional abuse includes, but is broader than, when I use verbal and conversational control to get my way with you. I will use a pattern of words and actions that are designed to subjugate, silence, hurt, confuse, analyze, humiliate, deceive, trick, isolate, define, defame, intimidate, monitor, threaten, control, correct, manipulate, exploit, limit your freedom, or when I am indifferent, excluding, and ignoring of you. I will act and think like I am an authority on you, but really I am not. I invade your psychological boundaries, entrap you, and ignore, obstruct, or overpower your rights. Now again, these patterns in coercive control can come and go a little. They're generally there, but they can come and go. There are some better days and some more fun moments and some moments that seem to be quite close and emotionally intimate. But underneath all of that, there'll be the attitudinal style and that web of dynamics. That means that you still do not have equality. You don't necessarily have good, strong emotional intimacy. You just have better moments. And that's what can be so confusing for victims of coercive controllers. So there's a woman called Patricia Evans who wrote The Verbally Abusive Man. Can He Change? A Woman's Guide to Deciding Whether to Stay or Go. Now, Patricia Evans is really expert in verbal abuse, but she also has a way of describing it which I really like. He may tell you what you are. He may tell you what you are doing. He may tell you how you feel. He may tell you what you need or don't need. He may tell you what you want. He may tell you what you don't want. He may tell you what you are trying to do. He may tell you what to do. He may tell you how you are. He may tell you what you think. Now, she is very much invested in the verbally abusive man, but these can be said for any gender. He may tell you what you know, should know, or don't know. He may tell you what you should do. He may tell you what you can't or couldn't do. He may tell you your future. He may tell you your past. He may tell you how to take things. He may tell you how to act. He may tell you what you have, and he may tell you what you don't have. He may tell you what you don't do. He may tell you what you are like. He may tell you that your perception is wrong. He may tell you how other people feel about you. He may try to justify his behavior. He may tell you that it isn't possible for him to talk kindly, especially to you. Now, I give this as a PDF to my clients so that they can really start to see how they were verbally and emotionally abused as well as conversationally controlled, because invariably a lot of the things that was said to them and a lot of the patterns of emotional abuse and the incidents of verbal abuse will actually come under one of those headings. So now let's go into the historical approaches to the effects, which are quite alarming, really. So because the conceptualization of family violence changed, so too did the understanding of the effects. So prior to the 1970s, the effects were of no real interest. The battered women, as they were called then, were seen as causing the problem, and it required detection, diagnosis, and treatment. Like, what is with them? Are they masochistic? Are they sadistic? Are they, what is it that they're wanting to get out of this? Why are they going into a relationship with these men? Why are they staying? So that was the general confusion. And the effects on the women were not even really considered. Then the main effects were seen as injuries sustained from physical assaults or forced sex, as well as STDs. And that was what all they understood about physical violence then, is that it would give you injuries, and they understood sexual violence as being forced sex, when of course it's a whole range of behaviour far broader than that. Now, Lenore Walker in 1979, she is an American researcher who located women's health issues as the consequence of their partner's abuse rather than the cause. Because prior to the 1970s, women were considered to be causing the problem. And then after Lenore Walker's work, she made it really, really clear in her extensive research that no, their health issues and their general issues were actually a consequence of the pattern of abuse that they were experiencing. So she really provided a major foundation to the effects. In the research process, women's own descriptions got lost in favour of standardised research tools. But when the research opened up to being more open and asking and exploring more and asking women for their experiences, things changed. But until then, the effects of family violence were just reduced to signs, symptoms, and predictive factors. Stark, his idea on the effects was that it was as much about what was done to the women as what was withheld from them and what they were not allowed to do or what they were made to do. Now, many studies did not actually include women who did not experience physical violence or only minor assaults. And it really wasn't until the late 1990s that the process of losing power, considering family violence as a capture crime, similar to experience of cults, prisoners of war, hostage situations, oppressive organisations and groups, and a colonising process, which was really only come about in the 2000s. So in the late 1900s, the use of recruitment tactics and intense influence procedures started to be understood. And that is really what coercive control is all about. It's not as useful to focus on discrete types of abuse. It's helpful, but it's not as useful to do that as it is to focus on the continuous chronic process of losing power in a relationship, the process of entrapment and having to relinquish oneself. And that is what the effects research should really be based on. Resisting behaviour, which people who are coercively controlled do. They do a lot of resistance of the whole losing power process, but it's often overlooked. And so is the reduction of the chances, the life chances of the victim of coercive control, and so are the losses implicit in being denied equality. So now we're going to move on to the responses to the web of dynamics. So rather than talk about the web of effects, I like to also talk about it as the web of responses, because the web of dynamics sets you up for certain responses that are pretty normal. And we can call it effects language, or we can call it response language. And sometimes I find that a lot of people prefer it to be called responses to coercive control rather than the effects. See what you think. So here we are with this web again. So let's start off with the superior entitled adversarial attitudinal style, the colonizing attitudinal style, which bleeds out through the entire relationship. And there's the web. And at the very core of it is a superior entitled and adversarial attitudinal style. That's at the very core. And the effects are confusion. That's the main one. It's critical, because when you're confused, you cannot decide what to do or what's going on. You lose your confidence. You have a loss of dignity, a loss of trust, loss of health, a sense of dying, changes in identity, brainwashed, self-doubt and self-blame, emotional distress, fear, worry, stress, withdrawal, feelings of going crazy, feelings of failure, self-harm, inferiority, just surviving, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll go into in a minute. So there's a whole array of responses to or effects of the dynamics of coercive control. As you can see, they are extensive. They'll be different for every person. There'll be a different level of certain types of responses depending upon certain things like the amount of support that they have, and also just how confused are they. Well, the more confused you are, the worse it is. The more trapped you feel, the worse it is. The less support you have, the worse it is. The less money you have, the worse it is. But it's very different. It's too hard to compare from person to person. There's also different levels of fear. Our clients and my research participants and the research all around the world talk about the different levels of fear, and one being the fear of their partner. It was like walking on razor blades. It was so unstable. It was like skating on ice. I used to get nauseous when it was time for him to come home. The fear of unsupported friends and family. His family said I was the problem. My family think he's lovely. If I took him on, I was taking on the whole bloody family. It was also his associates. The fear of being professionally misunderstood. You've got everyone against you. What do? You just feel so stranded. Our counsellor pegged me as being over the top. Our pastor asked me what had I done. The fear of being legally unprotected. I don't feel there is any care about the psychological threat. It's so difficult to have my experiences legitimised legally. I am aware that it is almost impossible to be free if we have children. They are really serious levels of fear. And so many of our clients and so many of my research participants, and in the research again all around the world, the fear of unsupportive friends and family is really full on, because so many coercive controllers have family and friends who will aid and abet them. And there are so many elements of society who will aid and abet, inadvertently or otherwise, a coercive controller. And a victim of the coercive controller knows that. And the fear of being professionally misunderstood is also enormous. When you go to a counsellor or a pastor or someone you hope for advice, and you get told that you're a bit over the top, or asked what you've done to set him off like that, or to make it so bad for the relationship, it's extremely demoralising, and it means you just don't feel like you can trust anyone. Many of our clients have had counselling experiences in the past. They can come from anywhere in the world, and they've had counselling experiences in the past where they were very worried about going to any counselling ever again. So now the overall effects of coercive control, and this is quite a bit of an eyeful. So here we are. It's just an eyeful, isn't it? I was trying to think how to make this more easy to see, but in the end I couldn't figure out a way except that this is what it is. Now, if we have a look at the superior, entitled and adversarial style bleeding out through the entire relationship and causing all those responses or some variation thereof in a victim of coercive control, then as well as that, we also have to consider that a victim of coercive control, depending particularly on the style of the coercive controller, will experience loss of status and reputation if they've been heavily defamed, and many have. Loss of voice, and that should be loss of voice and agency, not agenda. Loss of emotional and sexual intimacy. Loss of safety and autonomy. Loss of economic security, sexually transmitted debt, inability to thrive. A loss of life chances, education, work opportunities, and loss of social resources, friends, community, and hobbies, etc. Not only that, there are losses implicit in being denied equality, losses implicit in being denied autonomy, losses implicit in being denied agency, and losses implicit in being denied reciprocity. And lastly, there are also losses implicit in being denied accountability. Now, there is one eyeful, and the web underneath it all is there because these losses and these responses and effects become part of the web. It's extremely difficult when you are confused, when you've lost your confidence, when you have a sense of dying. In other words, you cannot see a way out and you're trapped and you're stuck and your self-esteem is going so downhill you don't know why you should be alive. When you have any of these feelings and responses, it makes it extremely difficult to A, know what to do, B, know who to trust, and C, make any plans to actually work your way out. And it's usually only after a defining moment when something happens that you really can't tolerate, where something happens to the kids where you realize, okay, this is just not okay, and you reach out for help and there's someone there, and that is often that's somebody who can help with the confusion and to create a team around that person to be able to help remove them from the situation. Now, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, not every woman or person of any gender who experiences coercive control will experience complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's really important to know about this. It stands for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's called complex PTSD or CPTSD. So it can be caused by any type of severe and long-term trauma, and usually involves situations where the victim has little or no control and it is difficult, dangerous, or impossible to escape. The types of traumatic situations which can cause this disorder include long-term childhood abuse and neglect, long-term domestic violence, concentration camps, prisoner of war camps, sex trafficking, and organised child exploitation rings. So here's a list of the symptoms that I got off the Australian Health Direct website. Periods of losing concentration, blanking out or losing memories, difficulty with a sense of identity or body image, physical symptoms that can't be explained medically, such as headaches, stomach aches, dizziness, and chest pains, disturbed relationships and cutting oneself off from other people, an inability to trust others, being vulnerable to abuse or exploitation, self-harm, suicide attempts, and substance abuse, feeling ashamed or guilty, and difficulty controlling emotions. On another level is Lily Lucario. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce her surname, could be Lucario, but she has experienced intense CPTSD from coercive control. And she writes that the symptoms can be also terminal aloneness, emotional flashbacks, hypervigilance about people, loss of faith, profoundly hurt, helplessness, toxic shame, a repeated search for a rescuer, persistent sadness and suicidality, disassociation, intense inner and outer critic, self-abandonment, procrastination, demotivated, hurrying, overwhelmed, shutting down, and a very flat effect where you don't feel anything and you don't show any emotion. So coming up is a video that by Richard Grannon, who is a life coach, and it's a really clever little video about CPTSD, and he focuses on emotional flashbacks because that is something that we work with our clients quite a lot, as they are common and they are really awful to experience. So hopefully this will load up.
Fascinating thing with CPTSD, the complex version of PTSD, is it tends to be accumulated over time by repeated exposure to many smaller events, perhaps some so small that the person can't even quite remember what happened, or they were so young they don't remember it, as is the case in childhood trauma, or they were in an altered state of consciousness so they don't remember it, as can be the case for people trapped in cults, for political prisoners, or people trapped in emotionally abusive relationships as adults, or even people who've been heavily dependent on drugs and alcohol in their past. This is what makes it complex, in that it involves multiple hard-to-trace stimuli, also called triggers. A further level of complexity here is that the flashbacks are not memories as we would normally think of them. When you remember something, or if I say to you, the girl remembered her dog, you would probably construct an image in your mind of a person with a thought bubble over her head remembering her dog. Or you would have an image of someone projecting an image like a movie projector out of their head of their dog. Now, what did you think when I said to you, the girl remembered the dog? Typically, we think of memories as being like short films, short movies we run inside of our minds. There are some visuals, there are some sounds, and there are some feelings that go along with those visuals and those sounds. With CPTSD, the memory or flashback has no such video running along with it. There are no visuals, there is no sound. It is only feelings in the body. The person will get the adrenal response of feeling under threat and the emotions of terror, dread, rage, or shame, or guilt, but no video that lets them know where this is coming from. The end result is the person's experience is that they just feel very strong, loud, and violent surges of emotion that are not pleasant with no real reason for it. Now, these surges of emotion can happen several times a day and can last from 10 seconds to whole days at a time, sometimes with multiple strong emotions breaking through. They then come to the conclusion that there must be something wrong with them, or that they must be mad. They also end up concluding that emotions themselves are bad. Why? Because their strong mood swings, called emotional dysregulation, are ruining their lives. They make them addicted, vulnerable, cranky, angry, sad, and volatile in their interpersonal relationships. Making friends and keeping them can be very hard. Getting a job and keeping it can be torturous. Even going to the shop can create huge levels of anxiety and dread. I know because I spent my teens and early 20s in exactly this state. To sum up CPTSD in comparison to classic PTSD, we have, number one, multiple root events that created the hurt. Number two, these events are not recalled as typical video-style memories. Number 3, the trigger for the flashback may be something saw or heard, or it may simply be the context that the person finds themselves in. Or it can also be an internal part of the person that is now sending trigger-inducing negative messages that show up as very nasty, internal, self-critical thinking. Number 4, the flashback is only the emotion and the somatic state in the body. Number 5, in comparison to PTSD, the flashback is only the emotion. And that's why it's called an emotional flashback. That's the difference between CPTSD and PTSD. Does this resonate with your experience? Do you ever find yourself swinging through multiple emotions during a day? Do you ever feel extremely lazy or unmotivated? Do you find yourself feeling angry, sad, depressed, ashamed for no reason whatsoever? Do you find it hard to do normal things that everyone else seems to find easy? Let me know in the comments if this is you. And be sure to check out these.
Very clever little video clip by Richard Grannon. It's really important to get help if you've experienced coercive control, simply because if you don't have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and not everybody does, you may well suffer from all kinds of confusion and pain and worry and loss, and you might just want to be able to process it. I get asked this a lot. Isn't it just pent-up anger, frustration, or painful feelings, though, about coercive control? And a victim of coercive control will say to me, I get so angry myself, aren't I part of the problem? So they're wondering if their partner just has pent-up anger, frustration, or painful feelings. And it's a good question. And here's the answer. If you were in an equal relationship, you'd be able to do a basic process of conflict resolution. You'd be able to see each other's point of view eventually. You'd be polite. And you try not to interpret one another, but to actually listen to one another and eventually come to some kind of resolution, even if it takes a while, and even if it's a little bit noisy. And you'll actually convey information to one another well. But in coercive control, that is not what happens. None of those factors happen. Certainly, there is no sensitivity to your feelings. There is no being polite. There is no avoiding gossip. There is no accurately interpreting your emotions, and there is no calmly arriving at resolutions to conflict. And there is no effective conveying of information. That whole process that you need to do to resolve conflict, and conflict can be quite frequent in an equal relationship, it just doesn't happen in coercive control. So in coercive control, you get treated angrily because you are not catering or submitting, adjusting or accommodating, not because you have violated their boundaries. It's very adversarial anger. And there's a world of difference between anger from an inflated sense of entitlement than the anger, frustration, and painful feelings that are the outcome of a chronic power differential and feelings of being abused. In coercive control, anger and retaliation are inevitable when you resist, counter, or challenge their control and domination. Your anger will be from a different place, that is, from a place of being treated poorly, abused, feeling ignored, obstructed, or deceived, etc. A coercive controller creates and prolongs one-sided conflictual interactions that are impossible to resolve without you submitting or catering. That is not true conflict that can be resolved. It is control. Anger and conflict doesn't explain why you are subjected to a relentless pattern of double standards, double binds, and boundary violations that deny you equality. and nor does it explain the physical violence or emotional and verbal abuse that can occur when you are distracted, asleep, contented, or busy and not even interacting with your coercive controller. Nor does it explain the behaviour that goes on behind your back. So anger and conflict often gets muddled up in coercive control. The anger of a coercive controller is entitled and adversarial, and it does not come from you violating their boundaries. It comes from you not meeting their expectations, which are unfair and irrational and really unequal. So now, finally, we're coming to the summary. The summary of today are 3 main points. The effects of coercive control depend upon the style of the coercive controller, the amount of social, community, and family support they have, as well as a sense of legal protection. Cleaning up and clearing up their confusion is critical. People who are coercively controlled are affected by an overall sense of relationship and trauma betrayal from someone who they thought they would have a fair relationship with, one that has some quality to it and one that is equal. And that's what might lead to CPTSD, is that intense relationship and trauma betrayal with the confusion. That means it's really difficult to process because of the actual level of confusion. Historically, the effects research focused on why women needed to be beaten, what was wrong with them, then the effects of physical and sexual violence, and finally to the loss of power and entrapment process, as in a hostage, prisoner of war, cult, or colonizing situation. So the effects are far more wide and deep and of greater breadth than was ever really realized before. And if you think about what the effects are on colonized peoples of being colonized, and you translate that into a coercive controller colonizing their partner, you get some sense of just how broadly we need to consider the effects of coercive control, or our responses to being coercively controlled or colonized. So that is the end of today's presentation. Thank you for watching and listening. And next week, stay tuned for the stages of coercive control. Please feel free to comment or like or share this video. If you want to contact us, the details are coming up. I want to thank you for listening. I do hope it was useful to you, and see you next week for the stages of coercive control. But until then, stay safe, stay well, and see you next week. Bye-bye for now.